A routine traffic stop, at least, that's how it begins. But when two officers target an elderly black man driving a classic car through a quiet neighborhood, they think it'll be just another day of intimidation and paperwork. What they don't realize is they didn't stop just any man. They stopped a retired Supreme Court justice, and what follows isn't just an arrest, it's an unraveling of lies, of corruption, of a system that nearly crushed the very man who once stood at its highest bench. What happens next is a fight for truth in the face of power, silence, and fear, and trust me, you won't believe how deep it goes until we lay it all bare. So settle in, hit that like button if you believe justice still matters, and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what part of this story hits home for you. Because this isn't just one man's battle, this is all of ours. On a quiet stretch of two-lane highway just outside Asheville, North Carolina, the late afternoon light spilled like honey over the hills, dappling the pavement through the thick arms of oak and sycamore that lined the roadside. The air carried the faint scent of pine and the earthy tang of fallen leaves, and the only sound for miles was the low, steady hum of a V8 engine gliding over smooth asphalt, its purr broken only by the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. Behind the wheel of a well-maintained 1966 Lincoln Continental Justice Elijah Monroe sat upright, both hands lightly gripping the wheel, his fingers slightly swollen from years of arthritis but steady as ever. He wore a navy blue suit, crisply pressed, and a silk tie in subdued burgundy, knotted tight beneath his collar, a quiet tribute to the formality he had never let go of, not even after retirement. He drove like a man who respected the road, not one who owned it. Each turn was deliberate, each glance in the rearview mirror measured not out of fear but habit, an instinct sharpened by decades of being both black and dignified in a country that often struggled to see the two as compatible. On the passenger seat sat a simple bouquet wrapped in brown paper, fresh from the florist in town. Its stems still damped the smell of lilies and freesia, sweetening the air inside the car. He had stopped by to place them on Clara's grave, just as he did every second Sunday of the month. It had been 7 years since she passed, but the rhythm remained. The flowers, the cemetery, then dinner with Ava, his granddaughter, and her mother, Sonia, at the college campus, just 30 miles north. He spoke to Clara as he drove, sometimes not loudly, just enough for his voice to rise above the engine. "You'd laugh at how much she talks now," he said, eyes softening at the thought of Ava's endless curiosity. "She wants to play the cello and prosecute war criminals in the same lifetime." He smiled faintly, one corner of his mouth lifting beneath a silver-streaked mustache. A hawk soared above the road, its wings silhouetted against the soft blue sky, and for a moment the world felt perfectly still, suspended in that rare kind of peace that only comes when the body and mind are both quiet. But even then, even with the serenity of the scene, something coiled just beneath the surface of Monroe's calm. It wasn't fear exactly, it was the memory of fear, the kind that shaped muscle memory long after the danger had passed. He had argued before the Supreme Court and later sat upon it, had signed landmark decisions that overturned unjust laws and rewrote others with language that would echo through generations. And yet, in moments like this alone, an old black man in a classic car on a back road in a white county, there was always the sense that the world could forget who he was the moment it wanted to. His titles, his robes, even his legacy could vanish behind a uniform and a badge and a split-second assumption. He adjusted the mirror again and caught his own eyes, still sharp, still clear, but carrying the weight of too many stories. At 76, he no longer walked as briskly as he used to, but his mind was a fortress, unshaken, deliberate, meticulous. The court may have been his calling, but Clara had been his grounding, and now that she was gone, the silence in the house had grown thick, almost too much to carry. That's why he never missed these Sunday drives. They gave him something to move toward, a rhythm to stave off the loneliness. As he rounded a slow curve, a pickup truck passed in the opposite direction, its driver glancing over briefly before looking back at the road ahead. Monroe nodded, just a polite gesture, but it went unanswered. He didn't think much of it until he checked his mirror and saw the truck brake suddenly, then disappear behind a bend. A few minutes later, another vehicle merged from a dirt path onto the main road behind him. A white SUV, no lights, no urgency, just trailing at a distance. He didn't change lanes or speed up. He just watched. People like him had learned long ago to measure danger not in obvious signs but in patterns. A vehicle that shadowed you for more than 2 turns, A driver that never passed, never backed off. The subtle things. He exhaled, slowly adjusted the bouquet slightly to keep it from tipping. "Still watching over me, Clara?" he asked softly. "Let's hope I don't need it today." The sun dipped lower as he neared the turnoff to Highway 14, the road that would take him past the lake and straight to the college campus. He flipped on the blinker, smooth and early, like he always did. But in the mirror, the SUV blinked its lights once, no turn signal, then accelerated just enough to draw closer. That's when he felt it. That familiar tightening in the gut, not quite dread, but something close. The knowing. He signaled again, turned smoothly onto the new road, and the SUV followed, closing the gap now. It stayed directly behind him for a mile and a half, before the red and blue lights finally flared to life behind the grille, sudden and sharp against the softening dusk. Monroe's eyes flicked once to the lights, then back to the road. His hands moved automatically, right blinker on, slowing to a smooth stop by a gravel pull-off, both hands raised to the top of the wheel, open and still. There was no panic in him. Only calculation. Thought. Memory. "All right," he murmured more to himself than anyone. "Let's see who we're dealing with today." And as he watched the door of the white SUV swing open and a young officer step out, hand already on his holster, Monroe sat in stillness, his heart beating with quiet resolve, not fear, but a weight deeper than fear. He knew this moment. He had seen it 100 times before on screens and in case files, in testimonies and depositions, in the tearful voices of mothers and the clenched fists of sons. But this time it was his turn. And even as the gravel crunched under approaching boots, even as a shadow grew larger in his side mirror, he stayed still like the stone carved into justice itself, refusing to flinch, refusing to forget who he was. Not now, not ever. The cruiser door slammed shut with a deliberate echo slicing through the still air like the crack of a gavel in an empty courtroom, sharp and final. Elijah Monroe sat motionless behind the wheel, his posture straight, his palms resting calmly atop the steering wheel, at 10 2 fingers, splayed wide, every muscle in his back quietly coiled from the pressure of decades past. The red and blue lights continued their silent spin behind him, bouncing erratically off the chrome edge of his side mirror, throwing splashes of color across the old leather dashboard that hadn't seen excitement in years. He could hear the gravel shifting under heavy boots, now slow and rhythmic, each step deliberate, measured not with the caution of someone assessing danger, but with the arrogance of someone convinced they were the one bringing it. A voice called out before the face appeared harsh, and clipped low enough to be firm, but loud enough to carry power. "License and registration." There was no "sir," no context, no preamble, just the command, dry as a courtroom transcript and twice as impersonal. Elijah turned slowly, careful not to startle meeting the officer's gaze through the half-lowered window, eyes steady, tone calm but undeniable. "I'm going to reach into my breast pocket for my wallet, officer. Then the glove box for the registration, all within your line of sight." His voice carried a quiet dignity, not performative, just measured, like someone used to explaining procedures, used to being questioned, and preparing answers before they're asked. The officer said nothing. In return, only nodded once stiffly, like the gesture was costing him something. Elijah's fingers moved slowly but with purpose, retrieving the slim black wallet worn smooth by time and use. The registration was exactly where it always had been, tucked neatly between insurance papers in a labeled envelope. He handed both items out the window, pausing just long enough to add with the same evenness in his voice, "Justice Elijah Monroe, retired. United States Supreme Court." The officer Langley, his badge red, snatched the documents, holding them just far enough back to pretend he was reading them, even as his eyes never left Elijah's face. "Supreme Court, huh?" Langley asked, lips curling into something between disbelief and contempt. "That's a new one. You boys usually claim NFL or Navy SEAL." There was a pause. Not long, just enough to feel like a decision point. Elijah didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't rise to it. "I've served nearly 50 years in law," he replied quietly. "You can run the plates. Or call dispatch. They'll verify everything." His voice wasn't pleading, just patient, factual, tired in the way that only comes from having to state truths that should have already been self-evident. Langley looked at the documents again, then back at Elijah's face, then over his shoulder toward the cruiser, as if debating whether this encounter was worth continuing. His hand rested a little too casually on the butt of his holstered sidearm fingers, tapping lightly on the plastic grip. There was no visible threat, not yet, but there was a tension in the air now, the kind that comes not from loud gestures, but from what's deliberately left unsaid. "Stay put," Langley muttered, and turned back toward his vehicle without another word, taking the license and registration with him. Elijah leaned back slowly, the leather seat creaking softly beneath his weight, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror, then the side mirror, then the woods beyond. His heart wasn't racing, not quite, but it was no longer resting either. He exhaled slowly through his nose, pressing his back into the seat, trying to remain grounded, tethered to the moment, not to the history, pressing in around him like heat through a thick wool coat. He could feel the old instincts rising again, not fear, but that deeper thing. The sharp alertness honed from years of knowing that your presence in certain places could be read as defiance, that your calm could be mistaken for insolence, that even silence could be held against you. Through the windshield, the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the trees, washing the road ahead in amber light. In another world, this would have been a beautiful evening marked by simplicity and peace. In this one, he was a black man alone on a roadside, in a predominantly white county, and a young officer who didn't believe his identity was deciding what to do with that disbelief. Monroe's jaw tightened slightly. Not from anger, not yet, but from the slow realization that this would not be a brief or respectful encounter. Minutes passed. Too many. Long enough for the silence to become a message in itself. Then the cruiser door opened again, and this time Langley approached with a different kind of walk, wider stance, shoulders squared, a posture that said, "Challenge me without speaking a word." The documents were still in his hand, but now they were joined by something else, suspicion sharpened into intent. Langley leaned down slightly, face closer to the window, now eyes narrowed. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, and the words dropped like weights between them. Elijah met his gaze. "Is there a reason for that, officer? I've complied with all requests." There was no edge in his tone, no resistance, just the kind of careful clarity you use when you want every word to be remembered accurately. Langley didn't blink. "I'm conducting an investigation. Your credentials could be fake, or expired, could be a stolen vehicle. Step out." His hand hovered again near his weapon thumb, now flipping open the snap of the holster with the subtlety of someone pretending it was an accident. Elijah's breath caught just for a second. He'd been here before, not this exact road, not this exact officer, but this dynamic, this balancing act between dignity and survival, between asserting your rights and living long enough to defend them. "I'm 76 years old," he said quietly, "and I have a spinal condition. If you'd be so kind as to explain the legal basis for this request, I'll—" Langley stepped forward abruptly. "Out. Now." His voice was louder, not a yell, but a command designed to echo. Designed to draw a line. Elijah's fingers gripped the edge of the door, his other hand still on the wheel. Slowly he nodded. "Understood," he said, and began to move, not because he agreed, not because he was wrong, but because the margin of error in moments like this was always too small to argue with. As he opened the heavy door and placed one foot on the gravel, he felt the tightness in his lower back flare immediately, the price of age and years on the bench and nights slept in cold chambers preparing for hearings that shaped the nation. But he didn't let it show. He wouldn't give Langley that satisfaction. When he stood upright, the light caught the thin gold pin on his lapel, the one Clara had given him the day he was confirmed. Langley noticed it. His mouth twitched. Not quite curiosity, something closer to irritation. "You think that pin means something?" he asked. Elijah didn't answer. He simply stood there tall, still, his shoulders pulled back against the pane. His silence wasn't defiance. It was presence. And in that moment the air seemed to hold still just for a beat, like the world was waiting to see who would blink first. The moment Justice Elijah Monroe stepped out of his Lincoln, the air shifted not with sound or storm, but with the quiet weight of something unnatural pressing down. The early evening breeze, once soft and indifferent, now seemed to stiffen, as if it too sensed what was coming, rustling through the trees with a sudden unease. Gravel crunched beneath his polished shoes as he moved carefully, mindful of his balance, the nerves in his lower spine flaring with each step, but not enough to show on his face. His right hand gripped the open door for a moment longer than necessary, steadying himself not from fear, but to retain a measure of dignity that felt increasingly fragile. Langley's stance had changed. He no longer approached as an officer checking documents, but as someone ready to escalate, legs spread wider, hand still near his holstered gun, eyes scanning Monroe's every move like a predator watching for a reason. Elijah's hands stayed where they had been visible, calm, slightly raised at waist height, the universal language of a man trained for decades to survive tense encounters, not with resistance but with restraint. He said nothing as the officer circled him slowly, the younger man's breath louder now sharp, and controlled the kind of breathing men use to keep adrenaline from overtaking sense. "You carry any weapons, sir?" Langley asked, voice clipped, not really asking, more like setting up justification. Elijah shook his head once. "No, officer, never have." His voice was even like water running over stone, measured, aged, and unwavering. Langley nodded as if unconvinced, gesturing toward the front of the car, hands on the hood, feet apart. "Don't make any sudden movements." There was no room for protest, no logic to question. The rules had shifted the moment Monroe identified himself, and now the unspoken stakes hung heavy in the golden light of the dying sun. Elijah turned slowly, fingers grazing the smooth metal of the Cadillac's hood, still warm from the engine. As he placed his hands down, a sudden jolt of pain ran from his shoulder to his wrist, a quiet protest from old joints never meant to be stretched this way. Behind him, Langley's footsteps grew closer again, the gravel crunching in uneven rhythms, now betraying a kind of restless energy. Without warning, the officer grabbed Monroe's left wrist and wrenched it behind his back, the motion rougher than necessary, the force deliberate. Elijah gasped a sharp intake through clenched teeth, though he still did not speak. He felt the cold steel of the handcuffs clamp down one wrist, then the other, the ratcheting sound loud against the quiet of the woods. "Is this necessary?" he finally asked, his voice, low but firm, the syllables carefully pronounced as if each word was its own piece of evidence. "I've complied with everything you've asked." Langley didn't answer. Instead, he gave a sudden shove, forcing Monroe's chest harder against the hood, sending a shudder through his aging spine. "You're acting nervous," the officer muttered, "which makes me think you're hiding something." Monroe felt the tension radiate through his body, not from panic, but from the acute awareness of how quickly a situation like this could turn from violation to violence. He had read hundreds of testimonies. He had ruled on cases where moments like this spiraled into tragedy. Now he was in one. The air around them was still the only movement coming from the occasional passing car that slowed slightly as it passed the scene, just enough to look but not long enough to stop. One car honked gently, not aggressively, almost uncertainly, as if to say, "I see this. I'm not sure what to do with it, but I see it." Langley seemed to register the attention too, and with it a flicker of caution passed across his face. He stepped back just slightly, but the damage was already done. Monroe stood cuffed, bent forward against his own car, not for a crime, not even for a violation, but for a presumption. Langley moved around him, now beginning a perfunctory pat-down, one that grew rougher as it continued, hands pressing into hips, ribs, thighs. Elijah winced as a knee met the back of his own, nearly causing him to lose balance. "You been drinking today, Mr. Monroe?" Langley asked casually, like they were standing in line at a gas station. "No, officer, not a drop." "You seem a little off," Langley said, now circling back to face him. "Eyes look glassy. Speech a little too calm. We're gonna do a field sobriety test just to be sure." Elijah blinked slowly, still hunched slightly from the pressure in his back, trying to calculate whether protest would escalate things further or whether submission would only invite more indignity. With respect, he said, "I'm 76 years old. I have arthritis in both knees and limited balance. I've told you my identity. You can verify it with one phone call." Langley's grin was almost imperceptible, just a twitch at the edge of his mouth. "Well then," he said, "I guess we'll see if you can follow instructions, Your Honor." The cuffs were removed briefly, just enough for the test. Elijah stood upright again, though slowly and with some effort. The stiffness in his knees made even the idea of walking a straight line seem absurd. But he tried. He always tried. For people like him, dignity was a performance, not for others, but for oneself, to prove that even when humiliated, even when manipulated, you still chose order over chaos. He followed the pen with his eyes as it moved back and forth in front of his face. He lifted one leg when asked, though it trembled almost immediately. "That's enough," Langley said, cutting him off. "You're all over the place." He scribbled something in his notepad, probable signs of intoxication. Further testing required. Monroe stood there, slightly winded, heart pounding not from exertion but from the cold realization that the truth had stopped mattering 5 minutes ago. This was a performance, just not one for justice. It was theater for control. He glanced up at the trees lining the roadside, their branches swaying gently as if whispering among themselves. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called out a sharp, high cry that echoed faintly against the hills. Elijah took a breath and let it fill him slowly, let it settle deep into his chest. Langley turned back toward the cruiser. "Sit tight. I'm calling in backup," he muttered, his tone now edged with something harder to place. Discomfort, maybe, or anticipation. Monroe looked down at his own hands, still slightly shaking from the pain in his shoulders, and saw the faint line where the handcuffs had bitten into his skin. He wasn't bleeding. Not yet. But something inside him had been bruised in a way that would not fade so easily. And as he stood in that golden light, surrounded by silence and suspicion, he realized that his body may have grown old, but his purpose had not. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about presence. And in that moment, despite the ache and the insult, he chose to remain fully present, not as a victim but as a witness to a truth this country still struggled to see. Ava Monroe sat on the edge of the auditorium bench, her cello bow resting quietly in her lap, eyes flicking toward the entrance every few seconds, each glance more anxious than the last. The low murmur of students warming up filled the air strings, being tuned, piano keys plunked in quick bursts, the soft shuffle of sheet music against music stands, yet all of it faded to static in her ears as her mind fixated on the silence of one phone screen. Her grandfather should have arrived 30 minutes ago, maybe 40, and he was never late, never. Especially not on Sundays, and absolutely not when it came to hearing her play. She checked her phone again, nothing. The screen glowed back at her with a smug kind of stillness, no texts, no missed calls, no voicemails. Her mother, Sonia, sat 2 rows back in the audience, flipping through the program but not reading a word, her smile polite but empty, the corners of her mouth twitching every time the entrance door creaked open. The seat beside her was conspicuously vacant, Elijah's name printed on the small white card taped to the armrest, now fluttering gently in the draft from the main hall doors. Maybe traffic, Ava muttered to herself, but the excuse didn't land. Her grandfather always called if he was running more than 5 minutes behind, even in his 70s. He held tight to his sense of punctuality, like it was part of his integrity, part of his character that couldn't be compromised even by age. Sonia's phone buzzed once, her head jerked down, eyes lighting up with hope, but it was only a reminder from the family calendar, prompting them to call Elijah's pharmacy later that week. She let out a breath too quiet to be a sigh, but too loud to be calm, then stood abruptly and made her way down the aisle toward Ava. "I'm going to step outside and try him again," she whispered, brushing Ava's shoulder. "You okay here for a minute?" Ava nodded, but her fingers were already tightening around her phone, the cello now forgotten beneath her hand. Outside, the crisp autumn air rushed in like a wave of reality. Sonia's heels clicked against the sidewalk as she paced, dialing Elijah's number for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. It rang twice, then went straight to voicemail, something that almost never happened. She waited for the beep, and then said calmly but firmly, "Dad, it's me. We're just a little worried. Call back when you can. Okay, love you." Her voice didn't shake, but her stomach had already started to knot. She called again, voicemail. She texted this time. "Hey, just checking. Ava's concert is starting. We're saving your seat. Let us know you're okay." Still nothing. She tapped her screen a few times, then opened the family locator app. It had been Elijah's idea after Ava got her driver's license, a shared location system meant as a precaution, never actually used in crisis. Today, the little circle next to Grandpa Elijah was grayed out, no location data available. Either the phone had been turned off, the battery had died, or it had been disabled. None of those possibilities fit. Not with her father. Sonia froze for a moment, standing by a low garden wall just outside the auditorium. The wind carried a faint scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, the kind of smell that usually brought comfort this time of year, but now it felt strangely hollow, like background noise, in a scene that had begun to tilt out of balance. She scrolled quickly through recent calls, checking for any incoming numbers she might have missed, then flipped to the message log. Nothing. It had now been over an hour since Elijah last checked in. She opened her contacts and dialed the house landline. It rang, no answer. Then voicemail again, her father's warm, measured voice greeting her from what now felt like a different world. She hung up before the beep. By the time she stepped back into the auditorium, her expression had changed. Not fear, not yet, but focus. The same kind of calm she had carried into courtrooms, depositions, and crisis meetings. The kind of calm you wear when you need to look like you're not unraveling. She leaned toward Ava, who was now tuning her cello absently. "I'm going to retrace his route," she said softly. "From the cemetery to here, it's probably nothing. Maybe he pulled over for something and his phone died." Ava looked up, eyes wide, already seeing through the explanation. "Want me to come with you?" Sonia shook her head. "No, sweetie. Stay. Play. That's what he'd want. I'll call you as soon as I know anything." Back in the car, Sonia pulled out of the parking lot with her hands tight on the steering wheel, her eyes scanning the road like a litigator, reviewing testimony, looking not just for answers, but for inconsistencies, for gaps in logic, anything that didn't belong. The cemetery was 20 miles away, a route they'd driven countless times. She checked the shoulder of every curve, every turnout, looking for a car in distress, a sign, anything. The sky had dimmed further, casting the hills in long shadows, and her headlights caught the edges of tree trunks and road signs like brief flashes of something watching. She called 2 local hospitals. No patient under the name Elijah Monroe. She called the county sheriff's non-emergency line, asked if there had been any reported accidents involving a black 1966 Lincoln. The woman on the other end asked her to spell the last name twice before transferring her to someone else who said, "Sorry, ma'am. Nothing in the system." Sonia hung up, feeling the weight settle deeper in her chest now. She considered calling her law partner but stopped. Not yet. Not until she had something more concrete. What she needed now wasn't strategy, it was fact. 10 minutes later, she reached the cemetery gates. The caretaker's small building was locked, the parking lot empty. She circled once, slow windows down, calling his name softly even though she knew he wouldn't answer that way. Nothing. No car. No footprints. Just the cold smell of stone and soil and the quiet rustling of dry leaves in the dusk. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Ava. Just a single message. Still nothing. She typed back. "Number on his route now. Stay put. I'll update soon." The phone slipped into the passenger seat, glowing faintly, surrounded by growing dark. She took a breath, looked down the long road ahead, and pressed the gas. And in that moment, between the turnoff and the silence, between the known and the looming unknown, Sonia made a choice. She would not panic. She would not spin worst-case scenarios. She would follow every thread, ask every question, turn over every stone until she had an answer. Because if there was one thing she had learned from her father, it was this: silence in the wrong hands can be used as a weapon, and the only way to disarm it is with relentless, steady truth. The second the handcuffs clicked shut for the second time, tighter, now colder, somehow Justice Elijah Monroe knew this wasn't about misunderstanding anymore. This was performance calculated and cruel, a ritual of humiliation dressed up as procedure designed not to discover truth, but to impose control. Officer Langley's grip on his arm was no longer measured, not the trained restraint of law enforcement, but the forceful clutch of someone trying to remind a man of his place. Elijah didn't resist. He didn't even flinch. He simply stood there as Langley yanked his hands behind his back, the steel biting into skin already tender from arthritis and age, while the younger officer's partner stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes averted, saying nothing. The wind stirred faintly through the trees, as if the forest itself had grown uneasy leaves, rustling overhead in whispers Monroe could almost decipher. Gravel shifted under Langley's boots as he walked him toward the back of the car, saying nothing, his silence laced with intention. Elijah could feel each step in his spine, the vibration of impact, radiating up through bones, worn by years of long days behind a bench, now dragged into a far less dignified arena. His thoughts were steady, not panicked, but methodical. He was already cataloging violations, counting the procedural missteps, mentally preparing the testimony he might someday be asked to give if he survived the night. When they reached the back of the cruiser, Langley stopped, pushed him forward, and began a search, not one rooted in safety, but in spectacle. Hands moved roughly across his back, underarms, thighs, and waistline, a search more punishing than purposeful, more theatrical than thorough. "What exactly are you looking for, officer?" Elijah asked calmly, the words shaped with precise control, his voice neither trembling nor combative. "Weapons, contraband, or just your own authority?" Langley didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the front passenger side of the Cadillac and opened the door without asking, rifling through the glove compartment like a man searching for a narrative he'd already decided upon. Elijah's heart rate quickened slightly, not out of guilt, but because he knew that now they were entering dangerous territory. The search had no warrant, no consent, and no cause. Still handcuffed, he turned his head as much as he could and spoke evenly. "You do not have permission to search my vehicle. I'm asserting my Fourth Amendment right." Langley leaned in deeper, ignoring the words, tossing aside papers and envelopes, brushing past the envelope with the car's title. The insurance forms a funeral program folded neatly from the day he buried Clara. Moments later, the officer stepped back out with something between his fingers, something small, translucent, and suspiciously out of place. "Looks like we've got something here," Langley announced, holding up a tiny plastic bag containing a white powder. The way he presented it, 2 fingers pinched like he was revealing evidence on camera, told Elijah everything. He recognized the choreography. He'd seen it before in countless wrongful arrest cases: the casual discovery, the pointed pause, the pretend surprise, followed by faux concern. "That isn't mine," he said quietly, with a voice so steady it cut through the show like a razor. "You planted that." Langley turned to his partner, a younger man who had yet to say a single word since the stop began. "Reed's," Langley called. "Get this bag logged. Might be coke, might be fentanyl. Either way, we've got a problem." Reed's hesitated just long enough for Elijah to notice. His eyes met the judge's for the first time, and for a split second, Monroe saw something flicker there: doubt, discomfort, maybe even guilt. But it vanished as quickly as it came, and Reed's walked silently to the cruiser, retrieving a small evidence bag and slipping the planted powder inside. Elijah stood still, blood rushing behind his ears, not because of the accusation itself, but because of how casually it had been staged. "This won't hold," he said quietly, but clearly. "You've turned off your body cams, entered my vehicle without cause, and now fabricated evidence. That bag didn't exist 5 minutes ago." Langley smirked, writing something into a notepad he hadn't opened until now. "Is that what you're going to tell the judge?" he asked, then added with a mocking grin, "Oh wait, that's you." The comment landed like a slap, not because it surprised Elijah, but because it revealed the deeper rot. This wasn't about a mistake or fear or even bias alone. It was about ego, about power unchecked, about the thrill of catching someone you thought was untouchable and dragging them down into the dirt. Monroe felt the ache in his shoulders deepen the weight of the handcuffs pulling his posture forward. But he refused to lower his head. His gaze remained level, locked onto Langley, not with defiance, but with clarity. "You may think you've written the ending," he said, "but this is just the preface." The officer didn't respond, just turned and opened the cruiser's back door with one hand while gripping Elijah's arm with the other. "Get in," he said. "Careful now. Wouldn't want you falling and hurting yourself, though that might make my case easier." Monroe bent slowly, the pain flaring through his hips as he maneuvered into the cramped back seat. The plastic seat was cold and slick beneath him, and the faint smell of sweat metal and rubber filled the small space. The door slammed shut, sealing him in with a finality that felt both sudden and surreal. Through the mesh divider, he could hear the low murmur of the officers' voices, Langley laughing, Reed's responding in short phrases, nothing clear but enough to suggest that they were now crafting the official narrative. Elijah leaned his head back against the seat, letting his eyes close for just a moment, and tried to slow his breathing. The pressure in his chest was building now, not fear, but the early warning signs of strain, the same feeling he'd had once during a particularly long hearing years ago, the kind that later required medication, and a stern warning from his cardiologist. "I need my bag," he called out, voice louder this time. "There's medication inside, nitroglycerin. I have a heart condition." There was a pause. Then Langley's voice came disinterested and flat. "You'll get medical attention at the station if necessary. For now, just sit tight." The engine started, and the cruiser pulled away from the shoulder, kicking up gravel behind it. Outside, the woods blurred past in streaks of orange and gold as the last light of the day slipped below the horizon. Inside the cruiser, Monroe sat in silence, his cuffed hands resting awkwardly in his lap, his body tense, but his mind still sharp. He began to count the steps they had taken, each violation, each insult, each decision made, with the assumption that no one would care, that no one would believe the word of a black man, even one who had once worn the robes of the highest court in the nation. And yet, as the cruiser turned onto the main road heading toward Oakwood Heights Police Station, Elijah wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about preservation. He was thinking about his son, his granddaughter, the systems they would inherit, and the hard truth that justice, real justice, had always demanded more than belief. It required evidence, and someone willing to carry it through the fire. The fluorescent lights inside the booking area of the Oakwood Heights Police Station buzzed with a low mechanical hum, casting a sterile glare over the scuffed tile floor and dull gray walls. Justice Elijah Monroe stood in the middle of it all, his hands still cuffed behind his back, the chilled metal biting into skin that had been raw for too long, his breath shallow not from fear but from the slow, rising weight of what had become undeniable. This wasn't a mistake. And it wasn't confusion, this was intentional, orchestrated, and designed to reduce him not only to a suspect, but to something smaller, something silent. The young desk sergeant behind the intake counter looked up from his terminal and blinked twice, his face going pale when he registered the name and face before him. "Sir, are you?" he began, voice trailing off into something between recognition and disbelief. "Are you Justice Monroe?" Before Elijah could answer, Langley cut in sharply, dropping a plastic evidence bag with an exaggerated thud onto the desk. "He claims to be," Langley said, his tone laced with mockery, "but what we've got is an uncooperative subject in possession of narcotics and fake federal credentials. We're booking him on multiple counts. Start with resisting impersonation and possession with intent." The sergeant glanced at Elijah again, this time longer, more carefully, as if weighing something behind his eyes. Monroe met his gaze steady and calm, despite the cold sweat forming beneath his collar. "I am Justice Elijah Monroe," he said, enunciating each word as if entering them into the official record. "United States Supreme Court, retired. These men have made a grave error, one that will not disappear in paperwork." Langley snorted, stepping back as if to signal the conversation was over. "We'll let the court sort that out," he said, though his smirk suggested he had no intention of letting anything get that far. The intake process moved forward with mechanical efficiency, belt shoes, wallet, phone, all placed into labeled bins, each item a silent stripping away of identity. His watch was taken too, the one Clara had given him their last Christmas together, engraved with the words, "Time tells truth." He watched as it disappeared into the evidence drawer without ceremony, his wrist suddenly feeling strangely bare, as though something essential had been erased. Fingerprints followed, then a mugshot, 2 clicks of a shutter that flattened decades of achievement into an image that would never tell the full story. No robe, no courtroom, no legacy. Just a tired black man in a rumpled suit, jaw clenched, eyes forward, holding his posture like a man refusing to bow, even as the weight pressed down from all sides. When they led him toward the holding cells, his feet moved stiffly the long hallway, echoing with each slow step, each one louder in the silence than it had any right to be. The door opened with a mechanical groan, revealing a room dimly lit by a flickering overhead bulb, its paint peeling, its bench stained and cold. A stainless steel toilet sat exposed in the corner, and the air smelled faintly of bleach, sweat, and something sour beneath it all. The cell door slammed shut behind him, and he stood for a moment in the middle of the room, letting the quiet press around him. There were others in the cell, young men, mostly black and brown, slumped against the wall, speaking in low voices or saying nothing at all. One of them looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "Yo," he said, not unkindly, just surprised. "Ain't you that judge from television or something?" Elijah nodded slowly, lowering himself onto the bench with visible effort, the ache in his knees flaring as the cold metal met his skin. "Yes," he replied. "Or at least I was until tonight." The man didn't laugh, didn't respond, just looked at him for a few more seconds, and then turned his gaze back toward the floor, as if something he'd long suspected had just been confirmed. The minutes passed slowly, each one marked only by the steady buzzing of the lights and the low hum of distant conversation between officers beyond the barred door. Elijah's chest had begun to tighten now, not panic, not yet, but that familiar constriction that preceded his cardiac episodes, a signal his body had given him before when stress had pushed too far. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, trying to draw deeper breaths, trying to slow the rising pressure behind his sternum. He reached up to loosen his collar slightly, then remembered his hands were still cuffed. "I need medical attention," he called out toward the cell door, his voice clear but strained. "I have a diagnosed heart condition. My medication was in the car, in the bag." No answer. He waited a moment longer, then called again, louder this time. One of the men in the cell turned toward the door and shouted, "Hey, this man needs help. He's having some kind of heart thing, man." No footsteps came. No reply. Just the hum, the light, the stillness. Elijah's vision began to narrow at the edges, a subtle darkening that made the corners of the room blur slightly. His breath came shallower now, his back pressing against the wall as he slid down slowly, trying to hold on to his sense of place, trying not to panic. His fingers tingled, then numbed. "Please," he said softly to no one in particular. "Someone get a medic." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he heard the sound of a key scraping in the lock. The door opened, two officers stepping in, one of them with a clipboard, the other with a look of irritation already forming on his face. "What's the issue?" the clipboard one asked. "He's having a heart attack or something, man," the younger detainee said. "He needs real help, not a damn checklist." Elijah looked up at them, his vision swimming, sweat dripping now from his brow despite the chill. "Chest pain, left side, radiating to my arm. I need nitroglycerin or an EKG, now." The officers looked at each other, uncertain. One finally nodded and spoke into his radio. "Medical, respond to holding. Possible cardiac." Within minutes, a physician's assistant appeared, wheeling in a blood pressure cuff and a portable heart monitor. He looked to be in his 30s, sharp-eyed, quick-moving. He knelt down beside Monroe and began assessing vitals, murmuring under his breath. "Sir, your BP is elevated dangerously. I need to move you now." "Do it," Elijah whispered. "Before this becomes a story you don't want to be part of." The PA looked up at the officer still standing by the door. "We need a stretcher, and he needs to be transported immediately." The officer hesitated. "He's under arrest." The PA's voice didn't rise, but it grew colder. "And if he dies in your custody because you delayed treatment, it's going to be a different kind of arrest. For you." The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. A minute later, the stretcher arrived. They lifted him carefully, his handcuffed wrists still behind him, his breathing shallow but steady. As the hallway lights passed overhead, he let his eyes close just for a moment, not to escape but to gather what little strength he had left. Because even now, even here, he understood one truth more clearly than ever. They weren't just trying to punish him. They were trying to erase him. But he was still breathing, still remembering, still here. The hallway outside the medical unit at Virginia Memorial Hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and something warmer beneath it, like machine oil mixed with worry, while the overhead fluorescence buzzed at a rhythm just slow enough to be distracting. Michael Monroe stood near the vending machine. His tie loosened his jacket, draped over one arm, and his phone held tightly in the other hand, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The call from the ER had come 30 minutes ago, his father's name delivered in a tone that was both calm and urgent, the kind of voice medical professionals use when they're still assessing but already concerned. He hadn't stopped moving since. When he had burst through the ER entrance, the nurse at the front desk hadn't even needed to ask who he was. She'd simply pointed down the corridor with a somber nod and said, "He's in cardiac 2. They're stabilizing him." That was the word that echoed most in his ears now. Stabilizing. Because it meant the opposite of stable, meant they were still holding him back from the edge of something. He hadn't yet seen his father. The last time they'd spoken was 2 days ago over coffee, discussing Ava's recital and some pending legislation about judicial ethics that his father insisted was toothless. Elijah had looked healthy, alert, tired perhaps, but not frail, certainly not fragile. And now, behind a closed door at the end of a cold hallway, he lay cuffed to a hospital bed while a uniformed officer stood watch outside like he was some sort of threat. Michael's breath caught in his throat at the thought. He steadied himself, pushing his shoulders back, as the door to cardiac 2 opened, and a man in a lab coat stepped out. The physician's assistant introduced himself as Dr. Thomas Chen, his voice calm but firm, his expression already layered with concern. "You must be Mr. Monroe's son," he said. "Your father's condition is currently stable, but he came in showing signs of severe hypertension and cardiac distress." Michael nodded, trying to absorb the words without falling into them. "He needs rest," the doctor added, lowering his voice, "and frankly, he needs to not be treated like a prisoner while he's receiving care." Michael's eyes darted to the armed officer posted just outside the room, his face blank, his stance rigid. "Can I see him?" he asked, trying to keep his tone even. "Legally, yes," Chen replied. "Morally, you should. But that man isn't going to make it easy. He tried to block the attending nurse earlier from administering meds until I intervened." Michael stepped past without asking for permission, brushing the edge of the officer's shoulder as he pushed through the door. The room was dimly lit, filled with the quiet beep of a heart monitor and the hiss of oxygen moving through soft tubing. His father lay propped up slightly, an IV in one arm, electrodes trailing from his chest, and one steel cuff circling his wrist, locking him to the side rail of the bed. Elijah turned his head slowly, eyes opening with effort but focusing quickly. "Michael," he murmured, his voice gravelly but unmistakable, carrying that tone of old clarity that had silenced so many courtrooms. Michael crossed the room in 2 strides and placed a hand gently on his father's shoulder. "You shouldn't be here like this," he said, voice low. full of everything he couldn't quite find the right words for. Elijah gave a faint, tired smile. Neither should an officer be posted like, "I'm a flight risk." 76 post-cardiac episode, and I'm the danger. His breath caught slightly, his chest rising unevenly. "Did they tell you?" he asked. "They planted something in the car. Fabricated it all. Langley and the other one, Reed's. It was scripted. I could see it in their eyes." Michael clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar burn of rage masked by professionalism. "I know," he said. "And we're going to tear it apart. Every piece of it. But right now we need you alive and lucid." Elijah nodded once slowly. "I've never been clearer, son. What they did wasn't just to me, it was a warning to anyone who looks like me and dares to have power." The two men sat in silence for a moment, broken only by the steady rhythm of the machines. Then Michael leaned in. "We're not alone," he said. "I've called Eliza. She's mobilizing now. Ava's video already made it to 3 civil rights groups. This isn't going away quietly." Elijah's eyes flickered with something almost like fire, dimmed by pain, but alive all the same. "Good," he whispered. "Let them run. Let them scramble." Just then the officer at the door stepped inside, clearing his throat loudly. "Visiting time's over," he said, without meeting Michael's eyes. "This is still an active investigation." Michael stood slowly facing him squarely, his expression unreadable. "I'm his legal next of kin. You can check with your superiors if you'd like, or the hospital's legal department. But unless you want to be the next name in a federal civil rights lawsuit, I suggest you stand down." The officer hesitated, then backed out without another word. Michael turned back to his father, whose lips now curled into the faintest smile. "Still the same mouth," Elijah said. "Still dangerous when cornered." Michael took his father's hand, carefully minding the IV. "You taught me," that he replied. "And you're not done teaching yet." The room fell quiet again, but it was no longer heavy. It was the kind of quiet that carries purpose, thick with everything unspoken but understood. Outside the window, the city carried on, cars moving through intersections, people walking past without knowing what was happening inside this room. But here in this small corner of fluorescent light and rumpled sheets, a man who had once interpreted the Constitution was now fighting to have his own rights recognized. And as the machines beeped steadily, and the oxygen hissed its quiet rhythm, Elijah Monroe closed his eyes, not in surrender but in concentration. The battle was already underway, and now it had his full attention. By the time the headlines started scrolling across television screens and mobile notifications, the truth had already slipped past the stage of deniability and entered the arena of public reckoning. It wasn't just a story anymore, it had become a mirror held up to a country still reluctant to stare into its own reflection. Justice Elijah Monroe, a name once whispered with reverence in law schools and printed in citations on federal opinions, was now plastered across social media with captions like asterisk, retired Supreme Court, justice wrongfully arrested police, claim drug possession, asterisk. Yet even in the blur of attention, speculation, and viral soundbites, the man himself remained steady, seated upright in his hospital bed, watching the storm he never asked for unfold around him with the same composure he once held on. The bench. The news cycle had exploded. Local journalists were first circling the story cautiously, like sharks testing blood in the water, but within hours the national outlets dove in head first. Civil rights lawyers issued statements, scholars offered cautious interpretations, and the public divided along painfully familiar lines, those who were outraged, those who were doubtful, and those who said nothing at all, their silence a form of complicity Monroe had spent his life fighting against. In the hospital room, the television was muted, but the closed captions ran across the bottom of the screen like a whisper he couldn't escape. Michael sat in the corner with a laptop open on his knees, his eyes scanning legal briefs, email threads, and messages from journalists. Every few minutes he'd look up, checking his father's face, not just for signs of pain, but for signs of readiness. They both knew what was coming wasn't just personal, it was structural. This was no longer just about being cleared. It was about exposing what made this kind of injustice possible in the first place. Elijah's voice broke the quiet. "They're going to try and discredit me next," he said, not asking but stating. "If they can't silence the truth, they'll try to pollute it." Michael looked up from the screen, the light of it still reflecting off his glasses. "They already started," he said. "One outlet's floating a theory about early-onset dementia. Another mentioned your wife's death and possible trauma-induced decline." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. And someone's feeding them false records, an old censure report that never amounted to anything. They're spinning it into a pattern. Elijah didn't react, at least not visibly. His face remained still, but his hands, though clasped calmly in his lap, had begun to tremble ever so slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper, more personal. Not because they doubted his mind, but because they were willing to weaponize grief. "They're trying to smear Clara," he said softly. Even now, Michael closed the laptop with a quiet snap and crossed the room, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "They're not just coming for you," he said. "They're coming for your legacy, your decisions, your career, your voice. This is about making an example out of someone who was supposed to be untouchable." A silence passed between them, the kind only possible between a father and son who'd already shared a lifetime of unspoken understanding. Then Elijah nodded once slowly. "Then, let's remind them why I wasn't." By mid-afternoon, the hospital administration had received word that the mayor of Oakwood Heights, along with the chief of police, was en route to the hospital, ostensibly to clear up the misunderstanding, though everyone in the room knew the real purpose was damage control. Eliza Chen, the family's longtime legal counsel, arrived minutes later, flanked by two younger attorneys carrying document boxes and grim expressions. She shook hands briskly with Michael and then turned to Elijah with the warmth of an old friend, masking the urgency of a crisis manager. "You look like hell," she said, not unkindly. "I feel like it too," Elijah replied, allowing himself the smallest smile. "They'll offer a quiet settlement," she said, cutting straight to the point. "Apology medical bills, a donation to the judicial education fund you started, all tied up neatly with a non-disclosure agreement." Elias Chaza didn't flinch. "And in return, I disappear." Eliza nodded. "Exactly. No admission of guilt. Just a misunderstanding. And they'll promise internal reforms that never happen." Before Elijah could reply, a knock sounded at the door. The hospital administrator stepped in first, her smile tense, followed closely by the mayor, Patricia Dorson, and Chief Raymond Morris. Their expressions were carefully calibrated, polished for press conferences and campaign trails, but there was no mistaking the edge in their eyes, the guarded calculation of people trying to contain a fire already out of their control. Justice Monroe Mayor Dorson began her tone, equal parts, warmth and diplomacy. "We want to extend our deepest apologies for the events of the past 24 hours. This was never supposed to happen." Elijah tilted his head slightly, studying her like he'd once studied witnesses on the stand. "No," he said quietly. "It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did." Chief Morris stepped forward, then holding a folder under one arm and extending another toward Eliza. "We've drafted a joint statement," he said. "Something respectful, measured, acknowledges procedural confusion, emphasizes our respect for the justice system." Eliza took the folder, flipped it open, and skimmed its contents before handing it to Michael. He read quickly, then looked up. "This is a liability waiver," he said bluntly. "You're asking him to sign away his right to sue, to speak, to seek justice." "We're asking for mutual understanding," the mayor said. "This situation has been unfortunate, but it can be resolved quietly." Elijah sat back against the pillows, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You want quiet," he said. "But what you need is accountability." There was a long pause. Then Morris's expression shifted just slightly, but enough for everyone to see the change. "Justice Monroe," he said, his voice lowering. "You have grandchildren, don't you? Bright kids from what I hear. Attend a good school." Michael stepped forward, face hardening. "You threatening our family now, Chief." Morris raised his hands in mock innocence. "Just pointing out that increased media attention often brings scrutiny. Things from the past resurface. Unfortunate timing can affect families." Elijah breathed in slowly, held it, then exhaled. "When I was a young man," he said, voice, "even I watched people like you make those kinds of threats to stop men like me from testifying. I didn't bend then. I won't start now." The mayor stepped in again, her voice slightly more urgent now. "Justice Monroe, we can make this go away. We're prepared to be generous." Elijah shook his head slowly, eyes never leaving Morris's face. "You already made it permanent." Outside the room, the hallway filled with the quiet sound of camera shutters. Word had gotten out. Reporters were beginning to arrive. Elijah could see the silhouette of a boom mic extending into the air just beyond the security line. The world was watching now, and there would be no rewinding the moment. Eliza stepped forward. "If you're done," she said firmly, "I suggest you leave. Now." Morris didn't argue. He simply nodded, turned, and walked out with the mayor close behind. In the stillness that followed, Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, then reached toward the drawer beside his bed. "There's something they don't know," he said quietly. Michael leaned in. "What is it?" Elijah pulled out his watch, the one they had taken, and since returned, then turned it over. Embedded in its face was a tiny red light, blinking softly. "I activated the recorder the moment they started talking about evidence," he said. "It's all on there, every word. Including the threats." Michael stared at him, stunned, then slowly smiled. "You're 3 steps ahead." Elijah nodded. "Always." And outside the window the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, but inside, a fire had already been lit, and this time they weren't going to let it burn out. By the time Justice Monroe stepped into the hearing chamber, the air was already taut with tension, like the kind that hangs in a courtroom seconds before a verdict is read. The carpeted hallway had been long and silent, save for the soft footfalls of federal agents flanking his sides, and the quiet rustle of papers tucked under his arm, a folder worn smooth at the edges, containing documents not just of legal consequence but personal cost. He walked with deliberate calm. His breath measured the subtle pinch in his ribs from the previous week's medical ordeal, now just another reminder of what it meant to keep moving through pain. Ahead of him, the heavy double doors to the secured grand jury room stood open, the polished brass handles catching slivers of overhead light as if reflecting back every question that had yet to be asked. Inside the room was quiet, not the sterile quiet of bureaucracy, but the weighty listening quiet of deliberation. A dozen citizens sat arranged in the familiar semicircle behind long tables, each one with a notepad and a bottle of water, their faces a mixture of skepticism, concern, and growing awareness. They were here not to try a man but to weigh a system, to assess the truth behind a series of events that had unfolded with both violence and silence, exposure and denial. At the center of it all, now standing tall in a dark gray suit, was the very man whose signature had once affirmed the legitimacy of the laws being tested here. Elijah set the folder down carefully before him, removed his glasses, and let his eyes sweep the room, not to assert control, but to meet each face, to see who was listening, not just with ears but with conscience. Then, with the slow, commanding cadence that had once quieted entire chambers, he began. "On the afternoon of the 15th of October, I was stopped by 2 police officers in Oakwood Heights, for reasons I still have not been formally told. I was handcuffed, searched without consent, and placed under arrest for crimes that were fabricated before my eyes. But this story," he continued, voice steady and sure, "is not about a traffic stop. It is about a culture, one where power can be misused with impunity, and where those who challenge that misuse are targeted not as citizens, but as threats." He spoke for nearly 3 hours, never once breaking stride, his recollection, a seamless thread of observation, legal clarity, and lived experience. He described the moment the plastic bag of white powder was discovered in his vehicle, the discomfort of being forced to perform sobriety tests on arthritic knees, the pointed turning off of body cameras, and the thinly veiled threats delivered in the hospital room under the guise of reconciliation. He referenced statutes, protocols, and precedents with ease, not as a show of expertise, but as evidence, because even now he knew the system only moved when pressed with facts it could not easily ignore. The jury listened, their pens moving less frequently as the testimony deepened. This was no longer just about law. It was about harm, the kind that weaves its way into the body, and memory, the kind that teaches a man how to keep his hands visible at all times, even when he wears a title that should protect him. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of his calm was louder than outrage. When he finished, there was no applause, no murmur. Just silence, pure and respectful, as the jurors processed what they had heard. And then, without flourish, he stepped back from the table, reclaimed his glasses, and returned to his seat, his posture still perfectly upright the way it had always been. Outside the chamber, the world had shifted. Federal agents working with court orders issued that morning were executing simultaneous raids on the Oakwood Heights Police Department, the mayor's office, and several private residences tied to the network of officials implicated in the growing web of misconduct. Body cameras, previously marked as lost, were being recovered. Server logs pulled from data storage and financial records that hadn't been touched in years were now in boxes moving under armed escort. Michael, waiting in the secure lounge adjacent to the hearing room, watched the news roll in on his phone in near disbelief. One headline read, Asterisk Federal Indictments, likely in Oakwood Heights, Corruption Probe Asterisk, and another showed a photo of Officer Langley in uniform captioned, Asterisk Central Figure, in retired justice's arrest now under investigation for evidence tampering. Asterisk. He looked up as Elijah emerged from the chamber, their eyes meeting in a wordless exchange of relief and grim anticipation. Heard you took them to school, Michael said quietly. Elijah's lips curved slightly more fatigue than pride. They were willing to listen. That's enough for now. They didn't speak much as they made their way through the secure corridors and out the back exit where federal vehicles waited. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the concrete, the light warm but sharp, as if trying to cut through the lingering haze of all that had happened. Later that night, back in the quiet safety of their temporary residence, Elijah sat by the window with a legal pad resting on his knee, the television muted behind him. Outside across the dark lawn, the silhouettes of two FBI agents stood motionless near the fence line, their presence both a comfort and a reminder that some battles once started don't end cleanly. Michael entered the room with 2 mugs of coffee, setting one down on the side table. "We just got a call," he said. Officer Reeds turned whistleblower. He submitted internal memos, emails, a backup copy of dashcam footage they tried to erase. Elijah looked up, his expression unreadable for a moment, then simply nodded. "He waited too long," he said. "But I'll take the truth whenever it comes." Michael sat down beside him, sipping slowly. "They're calling you a symbol now," he said. "Media outlets, law schools, social media. People are comparing you to Thurgood Marshall, even Frederick Douglass. You're trending." Elijah chuckled softly, the sound dry but warm. "They're welcome to their symbols," he said. "I'm still a man trying to stay alive and make sense of what it means when even the robes don't protect you." A long silence followed, broken only by the low creak of Elijah shifting in his seat. Then he added, quieter this time, "But if all this helps, even one person avoid what I went through, it's worth every bruise, every headline." Outside, the moon had risen, casting pale light over the trees and rooftops. It was the kind of stillness that felt earned, not given, the kind that comes after you've told the truth out loud. And someone somewhere finally listens. And as Elijah Monroe sat there, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the glass, he wasn't thinking about courts, or press, or even justice in its abstract form. He was thinking about every young man who had ever been stopped for driving while black. About every mother who waited at home and never saw her son again. About all the truths buried in silence because the system wasn't designed to hear them. He took a slow breath, set the empty mug on the table, and looked over at his son. "Tomorrow," he said, "we begin the real work." And with that, he leaned back in his chair, the weight of the day slowly giving way to the strength of something older, quieter, and more powerful than rage resolve. It had been almost a year since that October evening when Justice Elijah Monroe's life veered off the edge of routine and into the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. But the memory hadn't dulled, not in his bones, not in his breath, and certainly not in the echo of those steel handcuffs. The day now began, like many others, had since quietly, deliberately, with a cup of black coffee in his left hand, and the Washington Post folded precisely in half under his right. Outside his window, the morning light draped itself gently across the Supreme Court Plaza, a soft wash of gold over stone that felt both familiar and distant, like a place he had belonged to once but now watched from a slight remove, as though experience had set him just a few steps outside its circle. Inside his office, everything looked as it had before the framed decisions. The books arranged alphabetically by title, and then by relevance, the photo of Clara on the shelf beside his law degree. But Monroe had changed, and not just in the way his gait had grown slower, or the lines beneath his eyes deeper. The change was quieter than that, harder to name, but it lived in the way he listened now, in the way he read silence as carefully as argument, and in how his fingers brushed over the page with the softness of a man who knew how close he'd come to never touching it again. A knock came at the door, 2 quick raps followed by a pause. Michael stepped in, holding a document folder and wearing the cautious half-smile of someone who'd stopped assuming good news, but still chose to carry it anyway. "He signed it," he said, simply placing the file on the desk. "President just inked the Police Accountability and Transparency Act. They're calling your congressional testimony the turning point." Monroe nodded, not in pride but in solemn understanding. "Laws are only the first layer," he said, voice low and steady. It's the practice that determines whether justice lives or just survives. Michael sat across from him, placing a hand on the edge of the desk, fingers drumming absently. The foundation's expanding. We've filed 42 active cases in 12 states. Community boards are starting to get real teeth. And Officer Jackson, she's chairing the National Oversight Task Force. She's giving interviews, testifying next month in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. She's the real thing, Dad. Elijah allowed himself the smallest smile. She always was. Just needed someone to listen before they buried her voice. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun inch its way up the marble steps outside. It had become part of their rhythm, these pauses, these stretches of shared quiet that said more than conversation. The past year had taught them how easily the world could twist, meaning how rapidly justice could be reduced to headlines, how even truth had to be defended, like it was a closing argument in a hostile court. Eventually, Michael stood and walked toward the window, his reflection soft in the glass. "Do you ever think about how close it came?" he asked, not looking back. "If you hadn't survived that night, if Ava hadn't recorded the raid, if that whistleblower hadn't come forward, they were seconds away from burying the whole thing." Elijah didn't answer immediately. He just reached over, opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out the small digital recorder, the one he had activated during that hospital meeting, the one that captured not just the threats but the tone, the certainty, the naked arrogance of power unthreatened by consequence. He turned it over in his hand once, then set it back down. "I think about it every day," he said, not out of fear, out of obligation. Because if that bullet had landed 6 inches to the left, the conversation wouldn't be about reform, it'd be about mourning. And mourning doesn't change systems. It just adds another name to the wall. Michael's eyes dropped, his hand resting now on the windowsill. "But you lived," he said. "You lived. And you made them look. You made them feel it." Outside, the plaza was beginning to fill with people, students on tours, lawyers in suits, a group of demonstrators holding signs peaceful and still. One read, "Justice isn't a privilege, it's a right." Another simply, "We remember." And in the center of it all, just visible over the treetops, the new bronze plaque had been unveiled that morning on the steps of the federal courthouse downtown. It bore a quote from Monroe's own concurring opinion in Thompson v. City of Bradenton, the landmark ruling that now allowed civil suits against officers who violated constitutional rights even without exact precedent. Asterisk. When the law is used not to protect, but to control it, ceases to be law, it becomes power. And power, without conscience, is tyranny. Asterisk. He hadn't planned on writing those words. They came in a moment of clarity late one night while revising the final draft. Clara's photo had been beside him then, too. He remembered reading them aloud to himself, the way he used to rehearse oral arguments alone in his office, testing the cadence and the consequence. Later that afternoon, Elijah visited her grave, as he always did on Sundays, walking slowly through the manicured lawn past the rows of names carved into stone, some too weathered to read, others so new they still carried the scent of fresh granite. He bent down to place fresh lilies, her favorite, at the base of her headstone, brushing the grass lightly with his fingers, as if smoothing out wrinkles in a memory. "They passed it, Clara," he said softly. "All of it. The cameras, the review boards, the records database. Took a lifetime, and nearly my life. But it's here." The breeze answered with a faint rustle through the trees, and somewhere nearby a bird called once before, going quiet again. Elijah looked around at the stillness, at the early spring sun breaking through the clouds, casting patches of warmth across the marble stones. He knelt for a moment, not in grief but in gratitude, because she had walked with him every step of that journey, even when her absence felt louder than any courtroom microphone. And now, at long last, the system had blinked. Not collapsed, not crumbled, but blinked, acknowledging, however, subtly that it had failed someone it was designed to serve. As he stood and turned toward the path leading back to his car, his hands relaxed at his sides, his shoulders square, and his pace slow but steady. Justice Elijah Monroe felt something unfamiliar but welcome settling into his chest. It wasn't pride. It wasn't victory. It was peace, earned not given, quiet not shallow, and deeply, irrevocably his. There are moments in life that remind us reputation degrees or social status, no matter how high, can become meaningless in the face of a system that refuses to see people with fairness. The story of Justice Elijah Monroe reminds us that truth does not win on its own. It needs someone to stand up for it, even when the cost is dignity, health, or safety. But what's most valuable is this: he chose not to stay silent. With courage, calm, resolve, and unwavering belief in justice, he didn't just reclaim what was rightfully his, he cleared a path for thousands of others to follow. For those quietly enduring injustice, or who believe their voice is too small to matter within a vast and powerful system, remember, sometimes it takes just one person to speak up at the right time and in the right way to shake the foundation of that system. Never underestimate the power of truth, especially when it comes from a heart that's weathered storms, stood firm, and refused to surrender. If this message resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we can keep the fight for justice alive, one story at a time.